Hello. Welcome to the Synapse Energy Economics Third Thursday webinar. This is Bruce Spiewald, and Pat Knight is going to be talking today about EV-REDI, a tool for projecting out scenarios of electric vehicle impacts. Glad you could be here. Let me end the first slide. So this webinar will be recorded. And we'll circulate it later on along with the slides, so you can share it or listen to it at your leisure, re-listen to it if you want. You will be muted, and we're going to keep you on mute, but you can send questions during the webinar, and please do. This is a good chance to send your questions. Email them to webinar@synapse-energy.com, and we will make a reasonable effort to answer your questions as we go along. We'll have we can field questions along the way and at the end. There's also a chat feature in the WebEx software. Please use that for any kind of technical glitches. Also, while I've got your attention, let me remind you to block off November 15th, same time, same third Thursday. We will have another technical webinar there on some interesting energy policy or analytical issue. We haven't decided yet what that might be. We're thinking about something on cafe standards, perhaps, or electrification of buildings, but we'll figure that out over the next week or two. Meanwhile, though, you might want to hold the date and the time. Well, you know Synapse. And next slide. Our agenda for today is really about this new tool that we've made, why we made it, what does it do. We'll look at some applications and take suggestions on what kind of enhancements, other features, what other analysis we might want to do with that. So Pat Knight is going to walk us through.
Thanks, Bruce, and welcome, everybody. I'm Pat Knight, the developer of EV-REDI, and I wanted to kick things off first by just talking about EV-REDI in general and describe to those of you who haven't been following our blog posts what it is and what it can be used for. So EV-REDI is a cute acronym that stands for Electric Vehicle Regional Emissions and Demand Impacts, and the overall goal of the tool is to model impacts of transportation electrification for individual states around the country. So over the past year or two, we've been noticing pretty much enormous growth in terms of different stakeholders and policymakers who are wanting to understand how widespread electrification of vehicles could impact the electric system. But if you're one of those types of people and you're expecting or even hoping for a massive change to something as large as the electric system, it's really important to plan ahead. So that's where EV-REDI comes in. It facilitates that planning and allows us to quantify the impacts of increased electric vehicle penetration on electricity sales, greenhouse gas emissions, and avoided gasoline consumption. And since EV-REDI runs at the state level and not at the national level, it allows state agencies, NGOs, utilities, and lots of other organizations to better interpret the impacts of EVs at the geographic level that probably makes the most sense to them. So that was a general overview, but let's talk a little bit more about why we really made the tool. So first I want to start by talking about emissions. Much of the increased focus on the transportation sector in the past few months and years has been an increased awareness of transportation's contribution to overall emissions in individual states and also nationwide. So since the mid-2000s, there's been a lot of progress in terms of reducing emissions from the electric sector, although there's still, of course, a long ways to go. But starting in 2016, the transportation sector, for the first time, represented a larger slice of the emissions pie than any of the other sources. This chart here shows emissions from transportation, electric power, and buildings since 1990. There are, of course, greenhouse gas emissions from other sources like agricultural land use changes and things of that nature. But these are the CO2 emissions that make up the lion's share and are all the ones that are associated with energy consumption. So in all likelihood, the path to getting greenhouse gas emissions lower, especially within the transportation sector, that pathway lies through vehicle electrification. So if reducing carbon emissions is the goal, what sort of actions are we seeing today? So the sales of electric vehicles are increasing. The top chart here shows the cumulative amount of electric vehicle sales from basically when they really started at the beginning of 2011 through the most recent date that we have available, which is September of 2018. In September of 2018, we passed a bit of a milestone. Cumulative number of electric vehicles sold in the United States exceeded 1 million for the first time. This is still a pretty small percentage of the overall vehicle fleet. It's about 0.5% of all of the cars, trucks, and SUVs on the road. But monthly sales are accelerating, as demonstrated in this bottom chart. In September of 2018, monthly EV sales as a share of total light-duty vehicle sales exceeded 3% for the first time. And again, 3% doesn't sound like a whole lot, but it's 3 times larger than the same level of sales that we observed just 1 year ago. So along with increased deployment of the vehicles themselves, we're also seeing increased investment in the infrastructure that supports EV charging. Now, many states around the country are investing millions and millions of dollars in both charging stations and make-ready infrastructure. And if you're not familiar with the term, make-ready infrastructure is essentially the sort of the first step in getting charging infrastructure put in place. Many states are implementing it as a sort of getting the groundwork complete and available for vehicle chargers later on. Much of the investment that's currently taking place can be directly attributed to the settlement with Volkswagen for $2 billion. And this is over the Dieselgate issue that happened just a few years back. So this money was put into a bucket, sort of organized into another organization called Electrify America, and lots and lots of states are using this money for electric vehicle charging infrastructure.
So Pat, when you're talking about EVs, are you distinguishing between plug-in hybrids and the different types of EVs, or what's your definition?
So that's a great question. Throughout this discussion, when I say EVs, I'm talking about both battery-powered hybrids and the plug-in variety, so cars that can run on gasoline or can also be plugged in. I'm not talking about sort of conventional hybrid, if that's even a word really. That's your sort of first-generation Toyota Prius kind of thing, i.e. a car that does not plug in. Mm-hmm. So throughout this presentation, when I talk about electric vehicles, I'm talking about the kind of car that could plug into a wall if you wanted it to.
Thanks.
So the previous 3 slides, I think, lead to a bunch of different interesting questions. So as policymakers are perhaps working towards lower levels of CO2 emissions and witnessing a deployment of electric vehicles and charging infrastructure, these are sort of some of the planning issues that I think a lot of folks around the country are going to have to start contending with. Issues might include what sort of impacts might EVs have on the electric system, how might they impact total sort of big picture demand and infrastructure for power plants, and how might they impact infrastructure at the distribution level in neighborhoods. EVs have a lot of interesting questions associated with how they're used on an hourly basis, when they're charged, and what that means for the electric system infrastructure, again, both at the generating side and also down to the distribution level. And then perhaps one of the most interesting questions of all is what are the ratepayer impacts of EV deployment? As electric load increases and EVs become more widespread, who's paying for the infrastructure to ensure that electric vehicles have enough charging capacity or chargers themselves around cities and towns. There's also the impacts on the transportation system. So one of the interesting questions around EVs is the one related to if a person is buying an electric vehicle, what car aren't they buying instead? Is that car an efficient one? Is it a not efficient one? How is efficiency changing over time as it relates to CAFE standards, which Bruce mentioned at the beginning of the presentation? There's also a lot of interesting questions related to gasoline consumption. A large part of the United States economy in 2018 is tied to not just the production of oil, but also the consumption of oil. And as the transportation sector is the largest consumer of petroleum in the United States, looking at a future where where this consumption is reduced dramatically has a lot of pretty important impacts on the rest of the economy. And finally, there's this big question about EVs and emissions. So when EVs are deployed and replace cars that consume gasoline, emissions from the transportation sector are reduced. But as EVs consume electricity, there's the possibility that they could increase emissions if planners don't take certain actions or if certain policies aren't put into place. But it's not just CO2 emissions that matter. Gasoline-powered engines emit criteria pollutants that lead to smog and all sorts of nasty health impacts. And EVs play a role in potentially reducing those and understanding the level of reduction possible, and the monetized value of those health impacts can be very interesting and useful when doing cost-benefit analyses of EVs and EV infrastructure. So these are sort of the big picture questions and kind of the motivating reason behind why we developed EV-REDI. It's essentially a tool to help answer these questions. So next I'm going to talk a little bit about how EV-REDI works. So within EV-REDI, users first specify a projection for EV deployment. This chart over here on the right side, up on the top, shows logistical, or just really the actual adoption curves for different kinds of technology over time. So way back at the beginning of the 20th century, we have telephones and cars and electricity, and more recently we have cell phones and computers and internet. And what's interesting is many of these technologies follow a similar general pattern, which involves a period of time in which adoption is small or quite limited to early adopters, a middle period in which adoption ramps up relatively quickly, and then a final period in which adoption rates plateau and pretty much everybody or everyone that's possible owns one of these types of technologies or has switched to it. One of the interesting observations I see in this chart is that it appears that adoption rates have actually gotten faster over time. I haven't seen an updated version of this chart, but I'd be interested to see what would happen if you put things like, smartphones or Netflix or something else on here and seeing how that adoption rate changes. So anyway, we use a logistical adoption curve that's based on essentially an average of many of these trends developed by a PhD economist some years back. And that trend is basically selectable in EV-REDI. Users can pick essentially two data points. They pick today, and they pick some point in the future. And that point in the future could be based on some number of EVs sold in a certain year, or a percentage of the EVs sold, or some number of cars that are actually on the road. Another feature that we have is to develop a logistical adoption trend that's based on a set of historical data points. So that's what we've got down here on this lower chart, which is the EVs as a percentage of total LDV sales from 2011 through 2017, and this logistical adoption curve fit through them. But the curve isn't the only input into EV-REDI. There's lots of other important state-specific information. There's things like vehicle ownership lifetime, vehicle miles traveled, how efficiency changes over time, changes in vehicle preferences between cars and light trucks, And getting to the question that someone asked earlier, EV-REDI does differentiate between plug-in hybrids and battery electric vehicles. EV-REDI comes prepped with with default values for all input parameters, but it's also pretty much infinitely customizable. It builds data at the state level, but there's really no reason that the methodology couldn't be extended to the county or municipality level, or even other countries perhaps. And so far, most of the data in EV-REDI is limited to light-duty vehicles, although there is some information about medium heavy-duty vehicles like dump trucks and buses. And some of that is actually some of the more exciting sort of areas for the transportation sector. That seems to be where a lot of new things seem to be happening as far as vehicle electrification goes.
So Pat, going back to that prior slide with the adoption curves, you know, the EVs in the U.S. are, you know, we just hit, what, 1%? And so we're at the early point on some of these, if you look at the curves in the top graph.
Mm-hmm.
But can you comment on, like, what would make that go faster or slower, or how it might compare to something like refrigerators took, what, 30 years from the 1920 to from zero to full adoption. More recently, some of the things are, you know, seem like 10 years, like cell phones.
Sure.
But, you know, what would make that potentially faster or slower for something like electrification of transportation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting idea. So you've got a couple of different types of technologies on this top chart here. You've got some that are like brand new sort of technologies, like when refrigeration came out, there wasn't really an existing technology that was supplanting ice boxes, I suppose, but it's not really the same thing. Refrigerators are a vastly different product. Electricity is probably a better example. It's just a brand new type of technology. On the other hand, there's a couple of technologies on here that are in some ways replacements for existing technology, like cell phones to an extent. And I think what's interesting is EVs aren't strictly a brand new technology. People already buy cars and get around them in the same way. And EVs don't necessarily change the game or add something brand new in the way that you know, cars, just autos by themselves did. On the other hand, EVs in many ways represent a different version of an existing product. So I think the types of things that could accelerate the logistical adoption curve, or accelerate the curve to what extent it's logistical or not, I guess we'll see, might be things like just how good is the technology relative to the baseline tech, how cheap is it relative to the baseline tech, and those are the two big ones as far as I can tell. And there's lots of drivers within them. I mean, whether or not EVs are less expensive than existing technology, both have to do with the technology advancement for batteries themselves, but also can be chalked up to how state policies and federal policies interact with EV sales. So I don't know of anything specific that could cause the trend to increase or decrease, but I think that there's a lot of little things that add up to how the trend might play out.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear that. I mean, it's a long time ago, but cars themselves, you know, automobiles went over about 20 years, went from a couple percent to 60% of households. So that was pretty quick. Yeah. Anyway, we can go back to where we were.
Sure. So I had just been talking about inputs, so just want to talk briefly about outputs here. EV-REDI gives state-specific outputs on LDV-wide sales in stock, so that's sort of the baseline level of sales in stock for pickup trucks, cars, SUVs, minivans, all kinds of those types of cars. It also gives the EV sales in stock, so the percentage of sales, number of sales, and number of cars for EVs, specifically broken out by battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids. EV-REDI also gives outputs for vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, retail and the wholesale electricity sales, so that's sales inclusive of transmission and distribution losses. Has outputs for avoided gasoline, avoided transportation energy and BTU, and avoided CO2 emissions. Now, all of the outputs in EV-REDI are provided for any or all of the states really at the annual level, but this data can be allocated to monthly or daily resolution using other information such as certain load curves or driving patterns. Now, one of the things I want to just talk about briefly is that when we were developing EV-REDI, really working from the start to make sure that it could be used with a lot of other existing tools that are out there. Two tools that I want to briefly touch on here are Cobra and EVREDI. These are free, publicly available tools from EPA. If you haven't used either one of them yet, I heavily recommend Googling them and downloading them. EVREDI is a model that Synapse developed on behalf of EPA. It allows users to look at hourly changes in emissions in different regions with different levels of load. So one could hypothetically look at a scenario in which EVs were deployed in your region of choice and see how that affects hour-by-hour emissions. And then Cobra, which also in itself links to EVREDI, Cobra quantifies health impacts. So one could conceivably use EV-REDI to develop a projection of electric vehicles and then quantify the health impacts in a particular state. The other model I want to talk about here is Encompass, which leads me to my next slide. So if you've been following our blog, you may have seen a recent blog post about EV-REDI where we developed an extended trends trajectory. So this extended trends trajectory is the same logistical adoption curve we were looking at on the previous slide, but extrapolated through 2050. The chart over here shows this trend in light blue, and we've plotted it against a few other projections for EV sales from a couple of other organizations. So these include Bloomberg, which is the BNEF, DNVGL, Energy Innovation, which has its EPS model, and EIA, and this trend is from the most recent Annual Energy Outlook. So again, this is sort of an example application of EV-REDI. It's not necessarily the trend that we think is going to happen, but it is interesting to see that essentially an extrapolation of observed data points over the past couple of years gives you a data trend that isn't that dissimilar from many of the national level projections that other organizations are putting out. And I do want to point out that we're actually, for this blue line, we're developing a separate trend for each of the states and then just adding them together to get the U.S. total so that it can be comparable to these other values. So moving along, under this extended trends case, we wanted to provide some information about the types of outputs that you can get from EV-REDI and the sorts of questions that it starts raising that really kind of make you think. So this chart here is an output for this extended trends case where we're gradually ramping up to some high level of almost 100% of EV sales by the year 2050, and in the year 2025, it's more like 5 to 8%. 2030, it's more like 15%. So this figure here is focused on 2025 and graphs the amount of EVs that are on the road relative to the total number of light-duty vehicles that are on the road. And I've chosen these states, these 9 states for a reason. So these 9 states are signatories to the ZEV MOU, which is a memorandum of understanding that these states' governors have signed that have a goal of getting a total 3.3 million electric vehicles on the road by 2025. And under this extended trajectory, extended trends case, we find that these 9 vehicles together get 5.3 million EVs on the road in 2025. But since this extended trends trajectory is an extension of the trends that we're currently seeing in current states, we see that by 2025, the vast majority of EV stock is concentrated in these 9 states that are already among the leaders in terms of EV sales and adoption. Many, or pretty much the other 42 states, which include DC, are quite small by comparison.
So let me take a second just to remind people on the line. Feel free to email questions. We're happy to field your questions as we go along or at the end. Email them to webinars@synapse-energy.com. Go ahead, Pat.
Yep, and just to, sorry, correct you there, Bruce, it's webinar, so
singular.
If you type in S, it won't get to us.
Thanks.
So here's another interesting chart, and hopefully your screen is big enough to read it. I think the software actually has a zoom feature, so you can zoom in if you can't quite read the name of the state that you're interested in all in here. So here are two charts that at first blush look really similar, but I think have pretty interesting different implications. So the first chart over here shows essentially the electricity sales impact from EVs by state. And the way I've chosen to show it is describing the electricity sales as increases relative to today's electricity sales. So by 2030, that is. So what we're seeing is there are a number of states where electricity sales by 2030 represent a quite large increase. Both Vermont and California have electricity sales increasing by over 10% relative to today's level of electricity consumption. But on the U.S. level, it's actually pretty small, things considered. It's only a 2% increase. So I think this highlights the importance of thinking about different levels of geography as we're going forward thinking about electric vehicle deployment. A number that might appear to be small for a large area might have very different implications when zooming into a smaller area. For example, at the U.S. level, the change in total generating infrastructure might be quite small, but for the states that are having quite large increases in sales relative to today's levels, these states might be contending with different issues like distribution upgrades and how to allocate those costs.
Mm-hmm. So Pat, this scenario, we're looking at 2030 across the states, and the electricity sales about 2% impact, and on gasoline, it's a close to 4 on average. What is the EV portion in that year? The vehicles, are we at I don't know, 15% by then? Or what the?
That's a good question. So I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. But if I were to guess, I'm seeing in 2030, this is a chart of sales, and the total number looks like something like 15%. Now, sales always lead stock. You go out there and you buy new cars, and even if everybody next year bought an electric vehicle, there's still plenty of gasoline-powered vehicles on the road. So if I had to make a total guess, I would say the number is somewhere around 8 to 10% of electric vehicles as a percent of total cars.
Thanks. So how does the tool handle the stock turnover, or the adoption, the integration of the new vehicles, and then it's got retirement of the old cars, right?
Right. So we have input assumptions about vehicle lifetime. So we're actually not really modeling individual cars, but we are modeling sort of or tracking the addition of cars in certain years and their essentially removal in later years, and that's just sort of how the model fits together.
So you mentioned a couple of times the kind of extension of the trends. So we're really on the early tail of the adoption, and when we think about the extrapolation or extension of the trends, I have a couple questions. First of all, you don't mean just linear continuation. There's actually, in these scenarios, there's a built-in acceleration of the trends because of the shape of the adoption curve, right?
Right. So, I mean, one could use a linear extrapolation. So I'm just going to go back a couple of slides if you don't mind. Take a look at this image down in the lower right-hand corner. We've got a couple of dots here that represent the actual observations of EV sales as a percentage of all LDV sales over time. And one could just, fit a straight line to this. But what we're doing under this extended trends case is we're saying, oh no, technology adoption is usually much more like this logistical adoption curve. So we have sort of a hypothetical best fit logistical adoption curve that gets fit to the tail that we're observing with historical data. And this logistical adoption curve is different for every single state. States that maybe in 2011 had lower levels of sales, and 2017 had higher levels of sales, might be at a steeper point in the curve. Other states that perhaps are lagging altogether in terms of electric vehicle sales might still be at that very flat early stage.
So what if the user of this tool, or what if we're interested in a faster adoption? Maybe looking at announcements of vehicle manufacturers, who are making their whole fleet all electric, or all the new cars that they sell, or state policies and things like that. How would that kind of thing, kind of a more aggressive policy-driven scenario, be represented in this?
Sure. So, I mean, the logistical adoption curve is just sort of a starting point for developing a projection. But there's definitely other ways to do it in terms of thinking about it from a ground-up sort of forecast. So, as you were saying, Bruce, one could go and get a set of data about what sorts of goals individual states are hoping to make, or individual car makers have announced in terms of how many EVs they're going to be selling in individual years. And one could compile all of that information into a completely separate curve. Or you could kind of do both and use both the logistical adoption curve and that announced data to calibrate against one another and come up with what is, a most reasonable estimate of EV sales projections. But the tool itself is very flexible and really can do any one of those.
So another question, I'm back on the state bar charts. There's a savings. Are those, the electric side, is that in dollars or kilowatt hours or something else?
Sure. So the left chart is just in percentage based around kilowatt hours.
So it's an energy base.
Yep. So what I've done here is look at the total number of electricity sales that come from EVs in 2030 and compare that to the kilowatt hours of electricity sales that we observed in 2017. Now, the right way to do this really is to make a projection of electricity sales through 2030 that doesn't have any EVs in it. I didn't do that just because we're just making an example here. But I also don't think it's that unreasonable an assumption. Electricity sales have essentially been flat for the past 10 or 11 years. So it's not crazy to think that absent massive EV deployment or some other change, electricity sales might be expected to remain relatively flat through the next 10 years or so.
So a lot of what you've been talking about, Pat, is on a state basis, or aggregates of states. And there's other geography that might be interesting, like on a larger scale, maybe RTOs and ISOs, like what's the impact in the PJM or the MISO, and also generally, but not always, smaller than states. You got utility service territories that a particular utility company might be interested in the impacts on their service territory, which is only a portion of a state. How would you get at those, or could you, and if so, how would you get at those different levels of geography?
So I think the first one is actually easier. So when we do electric system dispatch models, and I'll actually show an example of it in just a moment, but those aren't generally just built at the ISO or the RTO level. They're built from smaller pieces than that, and the pieces themselves might be states, or they might be parts of states, or sometimes they're parts of states that cross state borders. Yeah. So I think EV-REDI is actually well suited to do this because much of the adoption of EVs, at least today and for the next 5 years or so, are it's not unreasonable to expect that they'll be driven in large part by state policies. So they'll be sort of attached at geographic level to states. But we can sort of roll this information up to put into electric system dispatch models and other models to see what the impact is at the ISO or the RTO level. And again, I'll show an example of that in just a moment. On the other side, sort of the going down to a lower level of resolution, I think a big piece that this hinges on is the amount of information that you have for those cities or municipalities or counties. In some cases, for some areas, that information is widely available and easy to come by. In other situations, it's not so easy, and one would need to come up with some good estimates of what those numbers might be. Maybe based on what the state is doing as a whole, maybe based on a similar county or municipality that does have publicly available data. So I definitely think it's doable. We've just chosen to do things at the state level simply because it's a good middle ground where information is widely and publicly available and allows us to jump into more detailed situations if the analysis warrants it.
Thanks.
So I want to move on to sort of our next example component here. So as I mentioned a few slides back, we wanted to take a look at what would happen when we drop our extended trends trajectory into Encompass. If you're not familiar with it, Encompass is an electric sector power dispatch model in the vein of models you may have heard of like Aurora or ProMod or Strategist or many others. We've been using Encompass a lot here at Synapse on a lot of different projects, including projects in New England like AESC and our analysis of the proposed Massachusetts RPS. We've also been using it in other areas around the country, including Los Angeles, Southwest, many other places. The nice thing about Encompass that makes it a good fit for analyzing EVs is it has a very flexible modeling framework from a time perspective. So Encompass can be run at an annual level, but it can also be run at a very granular hourly level. And the hourly level is where a lot of the interesting questions in EVs start popping up. So that's sort of a preview for perhaps another webinar. For this analysis, we focus more at the annual outputs as opposed to the hourly outputs. But just to give you a sense of perspective, the level of EV deployment in our extended trends yields a increase in required electricity shown by this blue curve here. So basically by 2050, this requires an increase in electricity sales, or electricity generation rather, of 800 terawatt hours. That seems like a lot, and it is for sure. It's about a 20% increase over the amount of generation that we have in place today. But what's interesting is if you go back and look at historical data, it's also about equivalent to the amount of electricity generation that increased in 13 years between 1995 and 2007, when electricity sales essentially flattened off. So the country as a whole has seen large changes in electricity generation and sales in past years, just not for some time, in the past decade or so.
Right, and when you say 20% increase, that's over a period of about 30 years. So that scenario seems like a growth of less than 1 percentage point a year due to EVs. Seems like it's in the manageable, significant but manageable sort of range.
Right. I mean, I think the interesting nuance to that is because we're modeling a logistical adoption curve, that rate of change changes over time. So it's quite small at the beginning and flattens at the end, but in the middle period, there's a huge increase in electricity demand from EVs under this projection, and that's what I think is really the trickiest period. Not necessarily between now and 2030, but between 2030 and 2045.
Yeah, so it might be it'll be more than 1 percentage point a year there, maybe 2%.
Sure.
And also varying widely by region. Sure.
So, like I was just saying, some of the interesting questions around EVs have to do with when you're charging them. For the purposes of this analysis, we assumed the load shape that's shown in this yellow chart, where the majority of charging happens overnight, but there's still some charging that happens in the daytime when people are at work or school.
So on this trajectory, Pat, of load growth due to EVs, adoption of EVs, there's a whole baseline issue that we're not grappling with, right, around basic load growth, energy efficiency programs, all that other stuff going on. And is any of that in the model, or is that something that would be handled outside of like in Encompass or elsewhere? Or?
So all of that stuff is happening outside of the model. So basically, our way of looking at this is we already have a lot of really good models. Encompass is one, MSEM is another, that model electricity changes over time, or projections to changes over time. What we didn't have was a really good model to estimate the impacts for electric vehicles. So what this model, what EV-REDI is intended to do is not really be so much of a standalone model, but really be one that feeds into the other set of models that are available, whether they're ones we use at Synapse or ones that are publicly available, like AVERT or COBRA, and give some additional information about a sector up till now that we didn't really have a whole lot of information about.
Yeah, thanks. And on energy efficiency in particular, by state, isn't there a tool that that could be used for that, or
Sure.
a separate other tool?
Sure. So there's a few other tools we've made them in the past that sort of take a look at energy efficiency and bring together state-specific data. Our CP3T model that we released a few years ago digs into this. So I want to jump to sort of the answer here. What happens when we model these electric vehicles in Encompass? So for this first quick pass analysis, we modeled the future sort of that would be, I would describe it probably as a worst case future. So under this scenario, we're looking at a future in which the incremental demand for electricity from EVs is met primarily with increased generation from gas and coal plants. And we didn't model this because we necessarily think it's the best way, obviously, or the right way even, or the most probable way. It's more to establish, like, even in a case where all of the electricity demand was met with generators that emit CO2, what would be the overall impact on CO2 emissions? So what we found is that there is an increase that comes from electric vehicles contributing to consumption on the grid. There is an increase in total CO2 emissions, but the decrease in transportation sector emissions more than offsets this to the tune of about 400 million metric tons by 2050. But I want to caveat it again. This is just one potential scenario. I think one of the really interesting considerations to think about is what is the effect of renewable portfolio standard policies on incremental levels of electricity sales. So if you don't already know about them, renewable portfolio standards essentially require utilities to procure a usually increasing amount of their, or increasing percentage of their electricity delivered from renewables over time. So it might be 15% this year, 16% the year after, 20% the year after that, 25% the year after. So it basically is a way to require the electric sector to clean up. And as electric vehicles are, or as transportation energy is shifted to the electric sector through EVs, an increasing amount of the transportation sector's fuel in terms of electricity is actually subject to renewable portfolio standards and cheap wind and solar. So I think that that's potentially a really interesting type of analysis that one could do, and indeed we have done in the past, which is as electric vehicles adoption increases, what role do renewable portfolio standards play, and what happens if these RPS policies aren't adjusted or increased as load increases? There's a couple of other questions that I want to flag here just to sort of get the juices flowing in people's brains. Things like what sort of electric vehicles are being considered in a base case. Sometimes sales forecasts from utilities or system operators or even the federal government might include some amount of electric vehicles in there already, and it's important to think about whether the projection that EV-REDI is developing is totally incremental to that. And then there's an aspect that I mentioned earlier, which has to do with what vehicles EVs are replacing. So this example that we've been talking about today assumes a future in which federal CAFE standards are, go into effect as planned circa 2017. But there are proposed changes at the federal level to CAFE standards, and under that future, you might see a situation in which EVs are actually able to avoid a greater amount of CO2 emissions, but perhaps the total CO2 emissions from all sectors increases as a result of a less efficient baseline. So we're going to open it up widely to questions in just a moment. But again, I think it would be nice just to talk about a few of the interesting issues and potential analysis design that questions that might be interesting or informative to people. So the first bullet here is about consumer preferences. Today in America, more Americans than ever are buying not sedans, but a type of car called a crossover utility vehicle. And if you're not familiar with this term, it essentially means like a small SUV or a bigger station wagon. These cars are usually not as inefficient as large SUVs or pickup trucks, but they're also usually less efficient than traditional sedans or subcompacts. What's interesting about electric vehicles is, by and large, the models that are available for purchase today are sedans and not crossover utility vehicles. There are a few models that are out there that are sold in relatively large quantities, but there's sort of this mismatch between the types of EVs that are available and the types of cars that Americans buy. And that's something that could play a role in thinking about not just the rate of adoption for EVs, but also thinking about avoided emissions and avoided gasoline. There's another point to get to my second bullet, which is really thinking about the electric system. So I talked a bit about the sort of the big picture, what's the impact at the generation level, but there's a lot of sort of interesting details when you get down to the distribution system. So in a future in which an entire neighborhood has electric vehicles, for instance, you might be facing a situation in which the utility is required to put in place some amount of increased distribution infrastructure. And there's a lot of interesting questions around, well, how much do you need? Maybe some, maybe none, maybe a lot. How much does it cost? How much should ratepayers be paying? And which ratepayers should be paying for it and how? There's this sort of other interesting question around the idea that because it's electric infrastructure, it's tied to the utilities. But so far, much of electric infrastructure has been installed by towns, cities, and states. So there's sort of a different kind of aspect there to take into account. And then just to skip down to the last bullet, because I want to leave time for questions, I think there's a lot of really interesting sort of secondary or tertiary questions related to electric vehicles in terms of their impacts on jobs and GDP. As electric vehicle deployment increases, you could see a different impacts in things like gas stations or oil production. You could see impacts in terms of how EVs impact public health, which can, of course, be monetized through the use of tools like COBRA, is an important element in terms of thinking about the cost benefit of electric vehicles and associated infrastructure. So, at this point, we'll turn things over to questions. So if you've got them, please send them in. We've been answering a few of them as they've come through, but we're happy to answer some more. Feel free to email us at webinar@synapse-energy.com, and we'll answer them.
Yeah, I think you've been answering the questions along the way, Pat, and we should maybe we'll close down now, but offer you can email questions. We'll follow up. Later this afternoon or in the next couple of days, feel free to email questions along, and give us a call, and we're happy to talk with you about what we're up to. So yes, everybody, thanks for joining, and please keep in touch. Oh, and pencil in November 15th at 2 for the next edition of the Synapse Third Thursday webinar.
Sure, and if you have any more questions about EV-REDI, or you're curious about how to use it or what could be done with it, feel free to either reach out to that webinar address, or our emails are here at the end of the presentation, and we can get on the phone and talk about it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.